Interestingly enough, though, the first artist that we'll talk about on this timeline really made his name in the UK, but he is from the US. And the first entry on the timeline is because he joined up with Little Richard's band around 1964 for about a year. He joined the band The Upsetters, which I briefly spoke about when I talked about Little Richard, um, just because it was sort of important. That time period was sort of important to the development of funk music, and of course, that also had an influence on Jimi Hendrix and his inclusion of sort of that funk sound and the development of that throughout his brief music career. And so that is the first individual on the timeline, Jimi Hendrix, and he's an interesting one because I I'm not sure you necessarily give him credit for originating any of these genres per se. He definitely has his own style completely, but he's an interesting person because he just kind of pops up here and there along the timeline, with Little Richard, and just kind of the way he fused all this together. And of course, he pops up again with a British invasion as he kind of not with the initial wave, but later he kind of makes his name in the UK and continues to move in a way of popularity during that sort of rock, psychedelic-ish movement that kind of went on with this freedom movement. Kind of got swept up in that in 1967. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. But to start off, Jimi Hendrix, originally known as James Marshall Hendrix, was known for a lot of innovations on electric guitar, namely the sound effects, just that rock electric sound that was unique to him. He also was very innovative in just the genre itself, coming up through the blues, R&B, rock, funk, just his songwriting, and of course his showmanship was a huge component of that as well, which I think some people might know him the most for, is that showmanship, especially during that era. And I think now that time has passed, people give additional credit to him for some of these other innovations like songwriting, that maybe were more overlooked just because people were just trying to digest the sound the sound and show that was emanating from him and his band at the time. And as a child, he was known for his creativity, and interest in science fiction and visual art. Apparently, he had success, as much success as I guess you can have as a child in school, with some of the art that he made. It was very clear, like, he was interested in science fiction, read a lot of science fiction books, and it definitely comes out in his music, so that's why it is included or added in this little bio here, just because it did certainly come out in sort of one of the reasons his music was characterized, besides the cultural movement, but one of the reasons his music was kind of characterized as psychedelic, because it didn't really fit other categories as far as the sound and the lyrics that I was writing about. It was kind of, very fantasy, very dreamy, and very scientific, science fiction-esque, sci-fi-esque, with some of the themes that were going on there. His mother passed away at a young age, and he had a pretty unstable upbringing. His brothers and his other siblings, were in and out of foster care. I don't believe that Jimmy spent very much time in foster care, but most of his siblings, were shuffled around quite a bit. His first guitar that he got was a cigar box. I think we've brought up cigar box type guitars, or different, sort of handmade guitars, where you kind of string strings across the cigar box and make a neck out of something, and you have your kind of a guitar, guitar-like, instrument. And Then he got a ukulele, and finally he got a acoustic guitar, I believe with the help of his father. Worked with his father um, on occasion. And one of the things that I think is pretty well known about him is he was a left-handed player, and he would then restring the guitar. He would restring right-handed guitars, so the strings were in the right order when he was playing them left-handed. And he ended up doing that for his entire career, which is interesting. I mean, his career was pretty brief, but at that point, I would think that there were left-handed guitars out, and certainly at his height of his career, he could have certainly had them made at the very least. I'm trying to think of other left-handed guitars during that time period, but one way or another, it could have happened. But that kind of became a part of his signature style and sound, just because of especially considering that he played a Fender Stratocaster. All those Fender guitars, of course, had like those inline neck headstock setup. So, you can argue that may have impacted the sound a little bit more than if it was a different type of guitar, like a Gibson or something like that. I think it's a little bit debatable, but if you look into it, there are different theories about how that may have impacted the sound here and there. He was definitely interested in the blues early on, blues artists like Elmore James and John Lee Hooker. And in the 1950s, he began playing in local bands in Seattle, which is where he grew up in the Seattle area. And he dropped out of high school and joined the Army. And the story goes as he did this to avoid jail time because he got caught with some other people riding in a stolen car. So that's the story, that he was able to choose the Army to avoid jail time. And so he was in the Army. He was part of the 101st Airborne, and he was there for about a year, maybe almost two. It kind of varies. The stories. I have never been able to confirm exactly when that was or what it was, the length of time. And after that, he ended up playing in Nashville with a bassist he had met in the Army named Billy Cox, who we'll hear again about later on. And the band was called King Casuals, and they played at other venues in what we talked about earlier back in the timeline, which was referred to as the Shetland Circuit at the time, also known as the Urban Theater Circuit. And he backed a bunch of notable R&B acts during that time. And later he moved with the band to Harlem. And in 1964, where we come into our timeline, is when he had a brief stint with Little Richard and the Upsetters. And also around this time, he reportedly met Albert King. And I know that Albert King at times refers to having met Jimi Hendrix, but I don't know what the time frame was. But apparently it was around this time. And he helped him refine his note bending techniques, which is interesting because I think, Jimi Hendrix is certainly a very prolific note bender, guitar string bender, and I think, I don't know who is considered to be the best, but Albert King is definitely one of those people who really maximized string bending techniques. When you listen to his songs, really bending in and out of notes. And it's interesting because you look at him and then you look at sort of that lineage with, if Jimi Hendrix kind of followed in, then you think of another prolific string bender like Stevie Ray Vaughan, also kind of working with Albert King for a significant amount of time. It seems like a lot of those type of players kind of had an interest in Albert King, because Albert King is certainly not the original string bender, but he, when you listen to his music, he's definitely, one of the had a very unique and interesting string bending set of string bending techniques, and it's very present in his songs, maybe more than others. Where I think you can say that other musicians used it to accent their songs, Albert King really almost used it to define his sort of electric blues that he played. And then so in 1965, he began playing with the Isley Brothers. And in 1966, he returned to New York. He toured with the Isley Brothers for a little bit, and then he returned to New York to lead a band he formed called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, which he started to play in the Greenwich Village clubs, which kind of became that whole area of New York kind of became kind of his base from that point on. His U.S. base, I should say, because he traveled out of the country and became well known out of the country. So this early style, this time when he kind of was able to start to really play his own music and not so much covers of other artists, you could really see the influence of guitar greats like Muddy Waters, T-Bone Walker, Albert King, as we just mentioned, Chuck Berry, and kind of infusing this and also, just expanding and experimenting and showing an inspiration from a really wide range of musicians. And he was discovered by producer and manager Chas Chandler, who got him to move to England in 1966. And he formed the Jimi Hendrix Experience at that time. And they got their first hit with their version of Hey Joe in 1967, which was part of their, really groundbreaking album, Are You Experienced? And that same year is when they came, they were based in the UK originally, as we just said, and they played the Monterey International Pop Music Festival back in the States, which, was really a showcase for them in the U.S., and it also really fit perfectly with the sort of countercultural social movements that were kind of rising up and taking place at the time. These sort of freedom and, anti-war, really the peace and love sort of themes that were rising up at the time, and kind of piggybacking off some of the earlier black social movements that had taken place in the U.S. And it was really this time where, he really got into, and that showcase really showed off his unique showmanship and his use of effects and feedback and distortion and improvisational skills that really, set him apart from other musicians and sounds of the time. And in 1968, they released an even more innovative album called Axis Bold as Love, and that was followed by Electric Ladyland. And so Axis Bold as Love, you can really see that really seems to be an album that, he was able to put his own fingerprint on, even more so than the first one, and continue to delve deeper into some of the effects, cutting edge effects of the time that were coming out. And then with Electric Ladyland, you kind of see that he's kind of arrived, kind of probably experimented in that fashion as much as he could, at least for that time, because you have to remember that effects and feedback at this time are new in general. So there was only so much you could do, even with, his success, his engineers and sound people could only, customize and rig everything up and get so much. And of course he was touring a lot, so you can only get so far as that goes. So by the time when Electric Ladyland comes out, it really is showing that he's kind of found his sound or sounds, and now is really interested in experimenting with other styles of music as well as other musicians. as he brought in a lot of guest musicians, or was seemingly, and of course Electric Ladyland also refers to the studio he built, and it was another intention to have this was kind of a home base where he could potentially facilitate some of these collaboration moments or sounds with a studio, a state-of-the-art studio. And so in 1969, shortly after the band broke up, and this kind of reflected Jimi Hendrix's continued ambition to expand the sound, and he briefly formed a band that was known as Gypsy Sons and Rainbows, which included Billy Cox, and that was for the Woodstock Music and Arts Festival. And then in 1969, he also recorded a track. It's called Doriela Dufontaine with Lightning Rod, also known as Jalal Mansur Nuruddin of the Last Poets. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, because we'll talk about the Last Poets in a little bit. But that track was really interesting because it was an example of early rap. Lightning Rod was a prolific spoken word artist at that time. And of course, spoken word has, that, rap essentially is very much stems from poetry in general. But, spoken word and the styling of the Last Poets to be utilizing spoken word along with, background music and instrumentals, that kind of has that early rap, hip hop culture, influence, or it has the early, what am I looking for? The early, it has some of the same early features, and resembles early hip hop to an extent, even though, hip hop culture kind of comes from a slightly different place, but similar. And then you could hear also Jimi Hendrix with his funk influences in the track as well, because he did the instrumental on guitar and bass. And so you see like additional versatility and also a new wrinkle where Jimi Hendrix's career may have headed if he had been able to continue playing longer.